Underground Railroad. All right. So let's go to the next slide here. Um, I always like to mention to students that the Underground Railroad was not underground and not a railroad. Um, they have, well, even some in the general public think that there was this massive subway that ran from the southern states to the Canadian border. And it was this underground thing that people managed to escape through, and I guess a subway, but no, we know this. The Underground Railroad was a series of routes from the south through northern states and on into Canada that was utilized by freedmen and women seeking their freedom from the late 1830s through the beginning of the Civil War. And you can see on your left this particular map. Some of you may be familiar with the Wilbert Seibert studies of the Underground Railroad. Really the first. I believe he was at Ohio State in the late 19th century, 30 years or so after the Civil War. And thankfully, he recognized that the stories of the Underground Railroad were going to be lost, excuse me again, if not preserved. So he made a point of collecting these interviews and published them, and they still remain a valuable resource. And if you haven't gone to them, the Seibert studies are online, and they're available for inspection. And they do have a fairly nice section on Indiana, and a particular section of accounts from Grant County people about their participation. So there are some problems with the Seibert study, but it still is a valuable resource. Problems like they certainly weren't critical of the information they got, so it was more accepted. And then of course it was edited. Sitting and I say, well, modern historiography sort of frowns on some of that stuff, but hey, I mean, Seibert was the new guy, and we're certainly glad he put this stuff together. Now, one of his main correspondents for the Grant County portion was our old friend Nathan Coggeshall, and I'm sure you researchers will know the name of Nathan Coggeshall. I for no other reason than that wonderful name, I feel rather attached to Coggeshall. He outlived most of these people that participated in the Underground Railroad, and there's a hidden treasure in that Coggeshall's diary is mentioned. I believe in Whitson, but certainly in some other sources, that Coggeshall kept a diary. Well, unfortunately, we don't have that diary. It has been lost along the way. So that's sort of the hidden treasure. I would really love to read Coggeshall's diary, but there again, that's we work with what we have. So again, it was not underground, and not a railroad. So the question comes up, well, if so, then what was it? Come on, change. Let me see here. How do I do this? There we are. It was resistance. Okay, there's a whole thing about the way slave stories, slave narratives, uh, and the narratives of the white players on the Underground Railroad. Uh, the focus, and this was a criticism of Siebert, was that it was all recorded white voices, and I mean, of course, fugitive slaves were talked about in there, mentioning families, and this group was from Alabama, and so, well, but it tended to downplay the role of African Americans in achieving their own freedom, and it has been, well, there's been a change in the last several years to try to, wherever possible, base the Underground Railroad story, place it in the Black freed men and women themselves, but certainly include the folks that helped them, the Nathan Coggleshells and the Baldwins and all these people are absolutely important. But if we understand or try to grasp what was the purpose or what was going on, it had to do with Black resistance to slavery. Now, there was a what do I want to say? There was a history of Black rebellion, armed rebellion against slavery. And the larger ones, there were like the Stono Rebellion in 1739 in Virginia, New York City Conspiracy of 1741. You see Gabriel Prosser, the German Coast Uprising of 1811, which was very interesting. It happened in Louisiana and was particularly, it was a large one, and I'm not brandishing the details of it, but it's only been really looked at in the last several years, but it was indeed a major uprising. I think one of the reasons, among many, that it might have been lost to a degree is that the slaves, a majority of the slaves in the German Coast Uprising were from Haiti. And there's that whole complication in American history with the rebellion in Haiti and the establishment of the first, I guess, the Kingdom of Haiti, and then the Republic. So we do have that, and then of course we have Nat Turner's rebellion. Now, Nat Turner's rebellion is really significant. I mean, they're all significant, but this plays more directly into the situation in Indiana, and the roads to freedom that were forged through Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, Pennsylvania, New York State. Nat Turner's rebellion, as you may know, was an actual armed revolt. There's a more modern painting of Nat Turner, who was captured. Turner was a Methodist minister. He was a freed Black and apparently a very effective preacher. And his preaching and his organizing led to a very bloody rebellion that extended in Virginia and in North Carolina, in which a number of slave owners were killed. And of course, all of the slaves that participated and hundreds more were, of course, punished very violently for this rebellion. Now, this struck fear in the heart of the slave-owning public in not only Virginia and North Carolina, but all up and down the coast, inland. It was, for some, the handwriting on the wall. Or if it wasn't the handwriting on the wall, it was the what should I say? It was the moment of truth. Now, there were several responses on the part of the slave owning community. Of course, they were taking more and more precautions about control of freed men and women, and already their lives had been controlled, but they were efforts to manumit became very much more difficult. This particularly affects the Friends, and the Friends in Guilford County, North Carolina, which of course was the sort of home ground of many of the families that settled in African-American families that settled in Grant County, as well as Quaker families that settled in Grant County. Now, the year 1831 is significant in that was a time of major opening of land purchases in this particular this particular portion of Indiana. So those of you who are researching your family, if they come from Guilford County, or even I think it's Orange County, one right across the line in Virginia. They probably came through Cumberland Gap, Kentucky, to Cincinnati, then to Fountain City and Richmond, and then on up to Grant County, and where there was a lot of land just freshly opened and for sale. Now, the African-American settlers from Weaver, many of whom had been freed persons for a long time. I know some of the research regarding, say, the Pettiford family, I know they have research going back all the way to Angola in Africa, where relatives came out of there to Portugal, then to England, and then to the New World, and as far as can be determined, were never really slaves. But that was not the case with most of the folks. But the problem was that the North Carolina legislature and most of the legislatures, they severely restricted manumission. In the past, the owner could just, by terms of his will, okay, or some sort of public going to the court and getting it done. But they cracked down on it, and it made it in a number of places so that if I were a slaveholder and wanted to manumit my slaves, I had to go to the legislature of North Carolina and get them to sponsor or get a legislator to sponsor a bill manumitting each one of those people separately. So that complicates things considerably. Also, you have the problem of a number of freed African Americans who no longer had their freedom papers. And when the Southern, when the patrols, this will later, by the way, breed slave catchers, okay? So they were like domestic slave catchers, but they were militias, okay? And they were sent out to bring back anybody they could get, any African, back to the plantation. And you administer punishment, which was often very severe, as I've mentioned. And this also put the Quakers in a spot. We'll get to that later. We'll talk about that later. So if you think about the Underground Railroad as resistance, it gives it a little different perspective. Now, what I want to do. Oh, before I do that, I want to share a story. If you'd be a little patient with me, this is a story about a woman named Eliza Wallace. Eliza was born into slavery near Middleton, Maryland in 1814, and she was taken from her mother at age 7. And this would be the first of a total of 4 times that she was sold. The third time, she was sold in Washington, D.C. to a gambler named John Sleefer, who purchased her as a maid to his wife and nursemaid to his children. And the gambler fell into debt later and sold Eliza Wallace. And this, it's one of the most tragic aspects of American slavery, was the forcible separation of wives and husbands, parents and children. In her life, Mrs. Wallace was married and had 4 children during the time that she worked for Slifer. And when she was sold away from her family, she would never have contact with them again. So again, a sad story, but it was happening increasingly. One of the other reasons, in addition to the terror that was struck in the hearts of slave owners by Nat Turner, was that Virginia and to an extent North Carolina really they wanted rid of freedmen and women, of course, but they also came to the conclusion that, well, slaves were worth a lot of money, a tremendous amount of money. And so, to buy land, you had to have collateral. You had to have cash, and they were short cash. So there was this massive sell-off of slaves to the newly opened areas in Alabama and Mississippi, and later Arkansas and Louisiana. Those of you that know about the American history, Indiana was part of the Northwest Territory. Well, Mississippi and Alabama were part of the Southwest Territory, and it was both of them were land deals. Okay, both of them were purposely designed to sell the land so the federal government could make money. Taxation was a real minimum. So what they did was they had slaves. They didn't load them up. They forced a forced march of men, women, and children to Alabama and Mississippi. It's sort of the African American counterpart to Jackson's Indian removal, the Cherokees who got moved to Oklahoma. All right, so let me continue here about Eliza. Her new owner, Harry Bonds, lived outside St. Louis, Missouri. On the trip west, the boat landed in Cincinnati. She was met by 2 strong men who picked her up and carried her for a distance. When they put her down, they told her to walk to a house up ahead and go in. The home of Quaker, now this will dear to the hearts of at least one of our listeners, it was the home of Quaker Levi Coffin, head of the Underground Railroad. Now, Bonds, the owner in Missouri, came to Cincinnati and advertised her for return. Now, Wallace tells that part of her success and escape was that the Bonds had mistakenly put her name in the ads as Nancy, and so instead of Eliza, and she says, on the arrival of a man working for Grant County resident Nathan Coggleshaw, John Allen, and David J., the young Wallace, along with 2 other women, one of which had 2 young children with her, were bundled up in the bed of a wagon. They began their journey to Grant County. Now, when they got to Grant County, reaching freedom, Eliza stayed at the home of Thomas Harris. Now, some of you will recognize Thomas Harris. Gas City was formerly known as Harrisburg, from the Harris family that settled there. And John Sugart, again, a very prominent name in the abolitionist movement in Grant County. And at the beginning of the Civil War, she married Isaac Wallace. He passed, and she married again. But she, from a small town in Maryland to Grant County, from forced separation from her mother, her husband, and 4 children, and from slavery to freedom, Eliza Wallace lived nearly 100 years of the most remarkable life, talking about her journey to freedom. So I stick that in there because I'm sure you folks that are researching Underground Railroad probably have run across these stories. The local paper, the Marion Leader Tribune, in the early 1900s, not a lot, but infrequently would publish, they would go and interview former slaves who were still alive and living in Grant County and record their stories. By the way, they're so much fun to research because, you know, when I got a hold of this, I thought, oh my gosh, sometimes things get changed around, you know, in their retelling. But being able to go online and being able to work the genealogy thing, John Sleefer was indeed a gambler in D.C. I mean, we have records, okay? And her marriages and Harry Bonds in Missouri, that sort of thing. So the story checks out in every detail. By the way, after the interview, it was recorded that she said she had to leave her home in Jonesboro and go to Marion to visit her daughter who was in the Emily Flynn home. So just an aside. Okay, so all this is tied up in geography, the abolition movement, and of course religion. I think the three things are very much tied together. I don't know if anyone has seen this map before. This it's the map of the slave population of the southern states in the United States, and it was compiled by, I think it was the Coast Guard or the Geodesic Survey people. This is Lincoln had this hanging in the telegraph room, you know, that he would go over and spend a lot of time listening to or getting the messages from the front. And he himself said this to him explains why the South would not win the Civil War. If you will notice what it is, the darker areas, it goes from light to dark, the lighter areas having very few or no slaves, to the dark areas where the slave population was rather large. And now this is 1860, but this information was around from 1850, I believe, at least the 1850 version. And you can see this business about, if you see North Carolina on the East Coast and you go out to where Guilford County is, it was not a whole lot of slaves. But it's also, it coincides with the area settled by the Quakers in North Carolina. You also see, if you go up across the Virginia state line, you will see what is now West Virginia. You know, you see the little peninsula sticking up at the top, which is where, say, Charlottesville, Charleston, West Virginia is located. And those were part of the 88 counties that seceded from Virginia after Virginia seceded from the Union. And so you had slaveholding Virginia, but there was a time when it would have been very dark, like you see it along the Mississippi River. So what this is telling us is it's documenting basically that things were getting worse. I mean, not that they were ever good, but things were getting much worse for slaves. Like I said, the coastal people were starting to sell their slaves to people out in the western areas. We're talking about King Cotton now. And if some of you may have read that most excellent book by Edward Baptist, it's been out for, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years, where he talks about the finances of slavery and the fact that slaves were collateral. And actually, different companies issued mortgages and bonds based on number of slaves. One of those concerns, I believe, was the Planters Trust in New Orleans, who ran a very large slave market and issued mortgages and bonds based on slavery. And the other, I believe, was Hartford Life Insurance Company, who insured slaves. But in any event, it's the industrialization of slavery. So what it's going to do is, as King Cotton becomes, more, what should I say, more a giant machine. It was industrial cotton farming, and it means that the workers were slaves who were industrial slaves. And I've read accounts where in Mississippi, the life expectancy, this is kind of interesting, life expectancy of a slave, a field hand, was 18 years. So they preferred to have slaves at age 10, 11, so they could get another 7 years out of them and not have to be in any way responsible for an aged workforce. Now, again, this is going to set up pressure. Well, how do you, what kind of resistance can you make to this? Well, there was the Underground Railroad. But it didn't start with that. It started with, and really the main form of resistance was personal resistance. So a lot of plantation houses burnt down, right? A lot of cotton crops were burnt up. There was self-protection. And of course, it carried with it a really severe punishment. And so there was that. And that, there's not a, what do I want to say? It was the predominant means of resistance, okay? And so the next step up would be running off, or as Frederick Douglass would say, stealing of self. Now, how they get these statistics, I don't know. They're probably, obviously estimates, but just dealing with, accounts, looking at local papers and stuff. Because when a slave ran off, it was advertised in hopes of getting him back, and you had the slave catchers out there. That the most common way of self-liberation was to run off to the woods and stay nearby. So, for example, if your family was still there, and the chances are pretty good it would be very hard to get away with your family. Now, some did it, but usually what happened, it was single men or a woman and her children ran to the woods. Now, if you've ever been to South Carolina or North Carolina in the Smoky Mountains, people today can get lost in those places. And there was a considerable amount of that sort of thing. And basically what they would do is live in the woods and then sneak back into town at various times and visit family or family. They've had secret places to meet, that sort of business. So that was actually the most pronounced. The Underground Railroad, there's some problems with the Underground Railroad. It's difficult. All right, it's a long way, and until you get to Indiana or Ohio, you're going to have to walk. Now, people walked a lot back then. I know. I want to say, I think Mr. Lytle, I think you mentioned Tom Weaver, who wrote an article in old age talking about his family coming from Guilford, North Carolina, through the Cumberland Gap, through Kentucky, up to Indiana, and then the Fountain City, Richmond, and then Grant County. It took 2 years. That's really most cases that have been documented. Most cases of slave escaping would be from Tennessee and Kentucky. Now, it looks fairly obvious if from this map that, if you've ever traveled down south, the two easiest states to get through are, on the highway, the shortest part of the trip, are through Kentucky and Tennessee. Then you get to Alabama or Mississippi or Georgia, and that is quite a drive. Well, imagine yourself, on foot or with your family in 1840 when, all these places are still densely forested in most places. And there's no one outside of your own group really that you could trust. So there's not way stations in Alabama. So you got to keep on the move until you get further north. So geography is going to play a big, huge role in this. So let's go on to the next, I think. Come on. Oh, there we go. Ah, yeah. Now, the Underground Railroad and abolitionism. So we need to talk a little bit about abolitionism. Political science is another one of my areas of study. People who study social movements believe that abolitionism was the first really modern political movement. And now there are political movements before this, but this was a worldwide campaign. Of the campaign in Britain, Wilberforce and company, and how that struggle was tackled to outlaw slavery. Was it am I not a man and your brother? They were good. Media, advertising, meetings, speakers, that sort of thing, and the various working men's movements in Britain and the women's movements were very much a part of this abolitionist movement. Now, in the United States, the first picture there of that smiley gentleman, Henry Clay of Kentucky. Henry Clay, the great compromiser, a fixture in American politics from 1812 to 1850. And Henry Clay was in favor of the abolition of slavery, but he wanted it done through the American Colonization Society, which was political cover for a lot of people. For James Monroe, President James Monroe, who was a slave owner and one of the founders of the American Colonization Society, the idea was to first send freed blacks. Now, it was tied up with this also the race business, removing blacks from our country. We will make this a white man's country. We'll remove blacks and send them to Africa, in particular not Sierra Leone, Liberia, capital Monrovia after James Monroe. And then what we'll do is we'll purchase, the government or whoever, there'll be various schemes proposed for the purchase of slavery or the abolition of slavery at a say anyone who born after year X would no longer be a slave, those sorts of schemes, gradual abolition, which actually the British did, and I believe in Jamaica. So there were some schemes out there. It was enormously popular with a lot of the public. It made sense to them. Lincoln actually, for a while, put forward the colonization schemes, but anybody who knew math and the population studies knew that it was not going to happen. It's hugely impractical. Okay, so the man on the right, you probably recognize, William Lloyd Garrison. I took Luther's phrase, "What, here I stand?" Okay, he was leader of the American Abolition Society. Now, his claim to fame is his call for total abolition of slavery, total and immediate abolition of slavery. Certainly a radical position for 1830s. It really stirred the pot. He endured a lot of persecution, including beating. He published a newspaper called The Liberator, which was distributed nationwide, except when it was mailed to the South. You know, the Southern postmasters took it out and burned it. But it had a wide circulation in the North. Now, the guy in the middle, we will all recognize as, you know who? Frederick Douglass, right? Frederick Douglass, called the Liberator, Frederick Douglass. Now, of course, Frederick Douglass had no time whatsoever for colonization. Okay. However, he and Garrison started out together. Garrison wrote the Liberator, as I mentioned, and Douglass participated in that. But the problem was that Douglass was aiming for black self-determination, which was different than what Garrison wanted to maintain control of the abolition. He wanted it done, but he wanted to be pretty much in the driver's seat and calling the shots. And so there was, they supported each other for a good long time, but there was later a falling out. I have a short thing that I wanted to share with you about Frederick Douglass that you might find interesting. Let me get my specs on here. This is from David Blight. I recommend David Blight to you, a contemporary historian. His new biography of Douglass is Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. And here he talks, you're probably aware that Douglass and his associates, one was Redmond or Raymond, and the other was a white gentleman by the name of Bradburn. But it says they went on a speaking tour. One of their stops was in Pendleton, not too far from here. And what happened in Pendleton was he was invited there by the Quakers, and it turned into a riot of local toughs who attacked the speakers and attacked, and particularly Douglass. And he was injured, and he had to be hustled out of there and taken to a Quaker farm and treated for injuries. But this is what Blight says about Douglass in Indiana. It says, in Indiana, the nerves as well as the bodies of the traveling band of abolitionists all but disintegrated. A mere week after the Pendleton attacks, the Eastern Reformers joined the Indiana State Anti-Slavery Society meeting in Jonesboro. This is our Jonesboro in Jonesboro, Indiana. Just a side note, the meeting was held at the Presbyterian Church there. Relationships were frayed, to say the least, especially among that party of three, Bradburn, Douglass, and Redmond. These abolitionists were anything but unified. Douglass interrupted Bradburn during a long speech about why people objected to abolitionism and tried to direct discussion to other topics. The chair sustained Bradburn. An angry Redmond came to Douglass's defense, and soon a personality-driven free-for-all of name-calling ensued, with such words as colored men and monkeyism spit out by Bradburn and Redmond, Redmond accusing someone of being a jackass. All this ugliness played out in front of public audiences. An Ohio abolitionist, Adam Brooke, took sides and wrote to Chapman in Boston. Chapman's the sponsor of the tour, suggesting that the two black men were at fault. They were still unregenerate men. Ooh, unregenerate men, he claimed, and always desired to be the lions of the party. By now, Douglass may indeed have wanted to play the lone lion in these shows. He was young, wounded, proud, and growing impatient with some of those moral suasionist abstractions, as well as perhaps some of his companions. He did not take direction well anymore, and the leadership back in Boston, again, took note. So Frederick Douglass and Jonesboro, Indiana. Now, some of you are probably familiar with the Grant County historian Whitson. Okay, Whitson's Centennial History of Grant County, which is like it's hard to describe if you've ever used it. It's really a valuable resource, but trying to find things in there are really difficult. It's really jumbled. It was, these histories at those times were actually money-making propositions. So you got a publisher, and you went around to folks and solicited contributions to have your families put in there, and amateur writers who really not very good. But in any event, Whitson tells a slightly different story. He does relate that story, but he leaves out the part that it was actually an internal struggle for self-determination. He pinned it on that third gentleman that spoke up, and he said that was due to some argument over Quaker doctrine regarding private property. But in any event, okay, so one of the mistakes that slave owners made was that they thought that their slaves were deaf. They heard the discussions at the dinner table. They heard the stories about what happened during Nat Turner's rebellion. They heard about these newspapers. I don't know that many would have seen one, but they heard about them. And they also were hearing about Uncle Tom's Cabin when it came out. They were hearing about, and they did know, they did in a lot of areas, especially in the East, they knew Quakers. And they knew that Quakers had assisted first their freedmen in getting land in Indiana, which was the Weaver settlement, encouraged and assisted by Coggeshall and Quaker families. And so they knew that something was afoot in the country. Okay, so it was the beginning of what will be called the Jubilee, in 1863. Now, I really feel that this movement was heavily influenced by religion, and of course we've talked about the Quakers. Our friend Bradford, Baldwin, Ratliff. Matter of fact, the whole Bradford family, the whole Baldwin family, the whole Coggeshall family, members of various meetings of Quakers. One was located across, if you're familiar at all with Marion, there's one right next to the airport in Marion, a renovated Quaker meeting house from this time period. There was another one more centrally located in Marion, I think at the corner of 7th and Washington Street. There was a meeting, and I believe that was the one that Bradford attended. And then, of course, the Presbyterians. Now, Presbyterians in the North, and particularly the Presbyterians in Jonesboro. It might have been due to the proximity of Quakers, and especially people like Abijah Jones, who was the founder of Jonesboro, a Quaker and abolitionist, and the folks in Fairmount, the Back Creek bunch, the Back Creek group, were that Back Creek. The road went basically from Fairmount to near Jonesboro, so they were all neighbors. Okay, so it was a dense area for Underground Railroad work. And then off into the north part of Jefferson Township with the Atkinsons, who ran a free store, one who sold only goods that were manufactured by non-slavery farms, cotton that was planted by freemen, and so there was this whole active thing, and then of course, and I was glad to see Mr. Lytle, the Wesleyan Methodists, and this is an area that is luckily, fortunately, receiving more attention. I was, as a history guy, I knew about the Wesleyan Methodists and their general opposition to slavery, but they were the pre-Civil War Wesleyan Methodists also took one step beyond Quakers in terms of full political and social equality. And this meant the establishment of women pastors, the establishment of African American pastors. That didn't happen in the Quaker movement. Now, I don't want to take away from the Quaker situation, because they were keenly instrumental in this. All right, but the Wesleyan Methodists were certainly present. Would have been certainly present at that meeting where Frederick Douglass showed up. Also, those of you who are wanting to do further research, and I encourage this, I did my own research on a Wesleyan Methodist by the name of Gerard Polycarp Riley, who actually didn't participate in the Grant County Underground Railroad, but he participated in Brown County, Ohio, which is down on the Ohio River, roughly the same age as Ulysses Grant, who grew up in Brown County, Ohio, and was very active in the Underground Railroad in Ohio and in Kentucky, and just had an amazing life. He ended up as pastor of the First Wesleyan Church in Fairmount. I mean, not the first church, but the Fairmount Wesleyan Church. And of course, the Back Creek group have also been identified. If you take a look at the exhibit that I don't know, Rhonda, if it had been taken down, but the exhibit that was quite well done about identifying the Wesleyan groups. And there is a great resource that I ran across. The Wesleyans in this time period were also breaking away from the established Methodist Church, largely over the slavery issue. And so Ohio and Indiana were prime areas of recruiting. And so they had people out here fairly soon, and coming up out of Ohio and some from New York to make converts. And there is a paper, The True Wesleyan. And I believe it ran from 1850, I want to say, maybe a little before that, to the Civil War. And then it changed to another, I can't remember what it was called after that, but they changed it. But anyways, what they did, they kept careful records of all the conferences of the Wesleyan Methodist Church. And there's really major records of activities of various Wesleyan groups. I enjoyed especially when they would have their love feast. They'd have their evangelical meetings and baptize and but then after the meal they would adjourn the formal part of the meeting, and they would hold rallies for James Burney. Now, James Birney was the Liberty Party candidate for president of the United States in 1844, and I think again in 48. And in the True Wesleyan, it mentioned that a number of infants were baptized with the name of James Birney, and then whatever the last name was. But we do know that this was this was a very, very active thing. Well, there was some. Well, I don't want to get into this necessarily, but I think the experience of the Quakers, both before and after the Civil War, were a bit different than that of the Wesleyan Methodists, and that's something, you know, we can go in at another time. But it's not bad stuff, but it's just an interesting way of handling certain things. And then, of course, the AME Church, and oh boy, capital letter. I'll dock myself 10 points. David Wilson. And I'm really enthused with David Wilson because when I ran across David Wilson, there was a discussion in history circles about, so what were African Americans who lived already as free people in the North? We don't have a lot of records of their role in conducting the Underground Railroad or leading the Underground Railroad, and there's a lot of reasons for that. It has to do with, if you take however dangerous it was to be a conductor or a organizer of Underground Railroad. For example, William Bradford, who even though a Quaker, he kept arms. And there's a really exciting story documented about slave catchers coming to his house in North Marion and demanding he turn over slaves. And every window in the Bradford house apparently had somebody with a gun. And there was a gunfight down there, the Battle of North Boot Street. But seriously, I mean, for people like Ratliff and Coggeshall and Baldwin and whatever, the peace testimony was a real thing and rigorously observed. So this meant when these Southern slave catchers, who were a pretty rough crowd, they had plenty of experience in kidnapping and all kinds of horrific things. And by the way, they were not above just grabbing, the first African American they could find and taking them back and, putting them on the market because, pickings were slim. But the AME Church, which was organized through the bishop in Richmond, and David Wilson was ordained by the bishop of Southern, I don't know, Southern Indiana. I think that was like the whole Midwest is a large area. And the AME church records are really hard to get a hold of. I mean, because this was considered to be a pioneer parish. The Weaver AME Church, for a time, at least until the 1850s and maybe a little bit longer, was the furthest north AME church in the United States, and David Wilson was the pastor. And not only did David Wilson participate in the Underground Railroad. Oh, first, before I get there, in Weaver, what happened was that there would be fugitives from the South who would be taken into Weaver. And the story goes, and this was told by the first generation out there, that there were a lot more people named Weaver out there than were actually Weavers. That they were given the name Weaver so that they could fairly claim that they were part of the freed African American community there, when a number of them were actually fugitives from Southern slaveholders. But Wilson worked with Coggeshall, with Nathan Coggeshall. And Coggeshall specifically mentions Wilson in his Siebert paper, and he's also mentioned in Whitson. And what Wilson would do, and Coggeshall documents this, Wilson would take families. See, there was a problem, as you can imagine. Most of, not most, but a significant number of the fugitives were men, single men on their own. Well, Coggeshall relates about these men would show up at their house. They'd be fed and whatever their needs were be taken care of. And then we're told during the daytime to hide in the cornfields, when the corn was up. This business about hiding people in the house, I suppose it was done, but I'd rather hide in a cornfield. I grew up in a country town, hiding in a cornfield was like, nobody could find you. All right. And also this business about underground tunnels, I don't think so. They may have been root cellars. Okay. But there again, if you got into the root cellar and somebody found the door and popped it open, what are you going to do? Barns, I think, were preferred because barns had lots of exits and places to jump out of and that sort of stuff. But Wilson's job, I digress. Wilson's job was to take families. And and Coggeshall mentions about Wilson would load up a wagon and put straw down and then put the women and children or whoever in the bed of the wagon and then put hay on top of them. And he would start off. Now, this is Coggeshall's testimony. He would go all the way to Battle Creek, Michigan. Now, they had to stop for water and all that stuff, but there was no seeking out shelter. It was like sleep in the woods. First of all, that area from Marion to the Indiana line was a little bit precarious. There were not a lot of Quaker. Matter of fact, I don't know of any, but there probably were some. Who that connection was lost. You didn't have that network, and so, or at least willing to take families. And so they were delivered to first Cassopolis, Michigan, which is not far across the state line from Indiana, and did have a Quaker, did have some Quakers. And then it was on to, over toward Detroit and across into Canada. Coggeshall said it was Wilson that handled this detail and, putting himself in an enormous amount of danger. He also mentions that he used his son as a guide, or his son took families as well, a significantly younger son, whose name was, just a minute, I will get it, Burden. Okay, I think it was Nathaniel Burden, who was a stepson of David Wilson. And so, to me, this was a really exciting thing to find that documentation. So, I'll tell you what, this is the end of the slideshow. Oh, I got one more thing. One more story. The family accounts, and I know those of you who are genealogists, that's a valuable thing to find. The family Bible with the names and the relationships, and all of a sudden it's things that you've been working months and months and months. All of a sudden it's clear, or conversely, you find out that somebody mistakenly did something wrong in the family Bible. But there you have it. My first experience in researching Underground Railroad stuff was I was talking with Dolores Betts. Now, some of you may have had an opportunity to talk with the late Dolores Betts. She was a wonderful woman and absolutely a font of knowledge about her family, who were the Beck family, okay? Becks and Becks, okay? And Beck. They were all the same family. And I did, and she furnished me with a written account from her grandmother about the Beck family, and taking it all the way back to slavery in southwestern Virginia, down there, Harrisonburg. Really beautiful place on the edge of the Shenandoah Mountains, Shenandoah Valley. And so I set about, my project was to see what I could find. Well, everything that her grandmother had written on the list was, we could substantiate, and more. Her great grandfather, Matthew Becks, came out of slavery in 1851. I think the figure was 1851, 52. He was manumitted by the will of his master. Now that could be done then, okay, and in Virginia, and he and his brother both were manumitted. Now the problem was that Matthew's wife and children belonged to a different master, who was not interested in manumission or sale or whatever. Now, of course, Matthew's master is deceased. And to make a long story short, what happens was that Matthew was unable to negotiate a price. So he ended up going out of the Shenandoah Valley, went to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, which was sort of the end of the railroad there going north. And then he went to New York City, and then he went to Boston. And he met with Samuel May, noted abolitionist, and Samuel May took him around, and Matthew pled his case. And he convinced a group of abolitionists to contact the master of his wife and children and secure their freedom. And this went on for a long time because abolitionists were generally not interested in paying any slave owner anything, but they did get the money, they did get the master, he freed his family, and then he had to go back because of his brother. They were having difficulties. The master's son contested the will, and there was a large trial, but interesting enough, Matthew and his brother won. Now, they couldn't plead the case themselves. There was a Mennonite neighbor who pled the case. But again, they went up, they went to Ohio, then to Indiana, down around Brown County, and then they came up to Weaver. So again, take heart, researchers. You can find this stuff. It's great. So I've talked a long time. How can I help? I'll get rid of this, I think. Okay, it's like hello? Let's see here.
Stop sharing. And,
stop sharing. There we go.
there you go. Okay, we had some questions come up in the chat. Let's see if we can find them. I think Renee's answered a couple of them. Tom wants to know, how many times did Frederick Douglass visit Grant County?
I think 3. There was 2 for which there's some document. Well, there's 3 mentioned in Whitson. Okay. This first one that we talked about, that I read about, was mentioned in Whitson, but it wasn't. Well, I wouldn't use that as the gospel, okay? But it did happen. He just didn't have, I don't know what the fact. He didn't have the facts, but this blight thing is really good, and it's really the last word on that. He came again sometime during the Civil War, and this is mentioned in several sources, but I can't find it in Blight. Frederick Douglass at one point, I've read this in another biography of Douglass, that Frederick Douglass enjoyed coming to Jonesboro. He had made friends with some of the Quaker families there, and he came during the war. Now, I happen to believe this could be the reason he came, because Indiana was late in getting into the U.S. color troop business. Even though the Emancipation, had been issued in '63, Indiana was dawdling around. Oliver Morton really didn't want to form an African-American military unit. Just because you were against slavery doesn't mean you weren't a racist, all right? I mean, there's that. And but what was happening was the 54th Massachusetts of glory fame, they were recruiting every place, and they started to siphon off Indiana recruits. So very quickly, Morton changed his tune and authorized the forming of the 26th Indiana. And there was big recruiting in Grant County because of Weaver settlement. And I'm guessing here. I mean, this is speculation. I think Douglas may have been there around that time, because there was a mention of a riot. Now, what's a riot? 10 people, 5 people, 3 people? I'm sure it wasn't a cast of thousands, but it was some Union soldiers on leave, reportedly. These would be white soldiers who were objecting to the emancipation, and there were fisticuffs. By the way, Douglas was a very big person and very strong, and I don't know that he worried particularly about fisticuffs. I think he can take care of himself, I'm guessing. The third time was after the war. Now, the person whose house he stayed in, this is what's frustrating about Whitson, is he'll talk about an incident and not mention anybody's name. He mentioned Frederick Douglass, but he didn't mention the guy here's name, who said that Frederick Douglass visited their humble cabin after the Civil War, and he still kept on the wall, hanging prominently on the wall, the pan that the family and Frederick Douglass ate from. They cooked everything in the pan, and that's how anyway, so there's 3 documented or semi-documented. The first one is probably the best documented. So 3, Frederick Douglass.
Okay. And you mentioned the exhibit. It is still up in the museum. However, the museum is currently closed, but it is still up, and we hope to have it up for quite a while yet. And also had, when David Wilson arrived in Weber?
Yes, I don't have the exact date, because he had to have been there prior to the Civil War. Obviously, he was still alive in 1916. I mean, you can look him up in the census. He's there, and he lived in Marion in his later years. But I'm thinking it has to be 1850, around that time, because the Wesleyan Church, I believe, was there in 1850. Now, like I say, I contacted some folks that do research in the AME stuff, and of course they suffered a lot from discrimination or driven out of places, and the churches were leveled and that sort of stuff. So I would like to give you a date, but it's not in my head. But it could be found.
So yeah, make sure, if you haven't looked through the chat, there's been some books recommended by different people for things to read or more research. Anybody else have any questions?
My gosh, this is like class. I've talked you all into a coma.
I have questions, but I've asked a lot, and maybe others have before I do.
Well, go ahead. They're not leaping in. Do a couple.
So, in 1851, the citizens statewide in Indiana passed Amendment 13 to their constitution that basically said no new blacks could enter the state, and that fines on free color of people who didn't register would be used to ship them out of the state. Did Grant County citizens, and I'm sorry I don't remember my source, were one of 3 counties that sent petitions objecting that amendment. Is there any documentation of who signed that petition or other actions that Grant County citizens took to try to persuade the state not to pass that amendment?
John Ratliff was very active in the constitutional movement, himself being an Underground Railroad man. And he, now I see I'm sort of working through this. I've looked for the petition and cannot find it. That doesn't mean it's not there. Okay, it was. I know what you're referring to. I do know that. Now the claim is that no person of African American descent was actually assessed that fine. That it was not enforced. I think it was probably, just looking at it, it's part of a deal, to get support for something else. And Ratliff, by the way, did get, he was the amendment to the Constitution calling for free public education. And then after the Civil War in 1870, he sponsored the Indiana Civil Rights Law, guaranteeing access to education and accommodations, which was never enforced in Indiana. But he's well, I think Ratliff may be key. I mean, some research around Ratliff probably would get you a result, but I do know. See, it's just like the slave catchers issue. Even though there were plenty of people in Indiana that supported slavery, even in Grant County, down around Matthews and Upland. If you're familiar with Grant County, the covered bridge down at Matthews, that's the Cumberland covered bridge. It's New Cumberland. And New Cumberland was a pretty good settlement down there during the same period, settled by people from Virginia who were pro-slavery. And now this may have been, by the way, now that I recall, they were blamed for this second uproar with Frederick Douglass in Jonesboro. It said some copperheads came up, and there were. I wrote a thing on the Knights of the Golden Circle in Grant County. Just up the road in Huntington was Milliken. The gentleman who was arrested for he claimed his rights to habeas corpus that he was arrested without a trial and held, and there was a case that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and he won. This was after the Civil War, but that was a pocket of. It wasn't just passive pro-slavery. There were some people in the area that were fairly militantly pro-slavery. But the thing in Grant County was that before the Civil War, over 50% of the people in Grant County were Quakers. And so this sort of would be a discouragement for anyone seeking any sort of, you couldn't get the legal structure to support it. You know what I'm saying? Like if you grabbed somebody, you're not going to get protection of the law like you might get in Southern Indiana. But even then, it was not, as far as I know, I think there was, I remember a case coming out of Madison, Indiana, where a person of color was picked up by slave catchers, but the sheriff stopped it, and there was a trial, and they refused to allow the slave catchers to take the man out of the state, and that was kind of a pro-slavery community. So, yeah, good questions. Good questions. I always remembered my history teacher's famous words: "Just because you haven't found the evidence doesn't mean it didn't happen." Right? We can't exclude it.
Any other questions?
Have you ever come across a mention or connection to Thomas P. Bulla, who ran the big station in South Bend, Indiana?
No. No. I'll tell you, the only ones northern Indiana. I'm from Angola, not too far from, and Angola had several, Angola and Elkhart. But I guess I haven't looked as far as South Bend. It's
yeah. His house is now part of. It's currently on the Notre Dame campus.
Nice real estate.
Yeah, he had relatives in both Grant County and Wayne County.
Well, that figures. That's the connection. There was Fort Wayne there were some sites in Fort Wayne, but the problem in Fort Wayne, actually, the truth is the Irish and the Germans. Not that they were pro-slavery, they were anti-black. Not entirely, but for the most, the Germans were anti-everybody. Seriously, I mean, that was always the joke, is that they had their own language, they had their own newspapers, they had their own restaurants, they had their own settlement, and the rest of you, But of course, the larger the place, probably the more danger you were in. You're probably better off taking your chance in the woods. But South Bend, no, that's not. I don't know if there's a larger map. I know that I was looking at. I've looked at before, and I saw it again today, of the more involved routes on the Underground Railroad, and there were other parts of Indiana. This was the map that I showed you. Really was just focusing in on east, the East Central and that eastern route from Cincinnati on up to Richmond and so on. And I'm certain that if you looked at that more involved map, you'd find, if there was any documentation at all, it would be there.
Yeah. So Thomas Bulla's father, Thomas Bulla was born in Richmond.
How do you spell that?
Bulla.
Oh, okay.
But now the cousins that settled in Indiana went by the Buller, Buller. Same family. Yeah. Buller is the Indiana pronunciation, or the North Carolina pronunciation, and then they switched the spelling.
Who settled in Grant County? What part of his family?
His first cousin. Okay, so Thomas Bulla was from Richmond, and he ended up in South Bend, but he had a first cousin, Martha Bulla, and she was in Fairmount and Liberty Townships from 1837 till her death in 1854. She was Mrs. Lytle.
Oh, okay.
I have a follow-up question about the impact of that 1851 anti-Black state amendment. And I think I already know the answer, that a lot of these laws and policies were not enforced in Grant County. However, did Grant County follow the law and require free people of color to register with the county? Or did they enforce the law that no one with an enslaved grandparent or great-grandparent would be able to serve on juries? Do those free Black registers exist, or were the jury laws enforced?
I'm pretty sure they weren't.
Mm-hmm.
A registration would be something that wouldn't be that hard to find if there was one. But I think there was. Well, I'll bring up you probably thought, as I looked at census stuff, as I look at names and so on, maybe this is a 20th century happy thought on a part of a former 60s kid, but I really believe that there was a time before the Civil War when there was a truly interracial community around Weaver, because there were people that, of course, were African Americans, but in the same family, there were white people. There were Native Americans, the Shoemaker family, who identified. You've probably seen these where everybody is called a mulatto. Okay, and then after the Civil War, they become black. All right, and that was true. No less true in Grant County. But for example, I've been very fortunate to know the Taylors and the Weavers from Weaver, and been invited to funerals and reunions. And there's such interesting discussions about free blacks and free whites, and relationships running all the way back to North Carolina. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're talking marriages with children, the names, and the question is, as a naive researcher, and I would ask this, I'd say, now listen, I don't want to embarrass anybody, but wait a minute, is this guy Aaron Betts? Is Aaron Betts, who was one of the Quakers? There's a question here. Is Aaron Betts black or white? Or maybe it doesn't make any, what I'm saying? Now, knowing what we know about the history of black-white relationships in the United States, this would be a very unusual thing. But it happened. Noah Burden that I was talking about. That his real name came to me. The young man that was David Wilson's stepson, that helped with the Underground Railroad. Mm-hmm. Noah Burden, I found his discharge papers from the Civil War. Hmm. By the way, I got all the discharge papers from the black soldiers from Grant County in the Civil War. And, they had to, if you worked with these things, about pension records. Yeah. That actually Civil War pension records are much more valuable than the discharge, because the pension records follow them all the way through their life. Because they had to reapply for pensions, or when they became disabled, they had to, and if they were seeking a place at the National Military Home, there had to be documentation in the pension office. And John Weaver, who ran the grocery store and the post office in Weaver, was also the man that helped them fill out their pension papers. So a lot of times these guys, and now they could generally read and write, but it was your time for your pension. You want, and Weaver could, dress it up, so it looked nice and all that sort of stuff. But Noah Weaver's pension papers said, although a man of color, I served in I want to say the 37th Indiana Volunteer. It's 37th or 30. I get those numbers. I'm not good at that. But he served in a white unit, and with his neighbors. The deal in the Civil War. You went with your friends, and apparently, I think he was in Marion at the time. But he had to go to. They all had to go to Jonesboro to enlist. That was where the enlistments were being taken. So I really feel strongly, though, that there was a time, okay? I like to think there was a time when people really were empathetic and really formed strong friendships and strong bonds, across, and even relationships across racial lines, which would have been frankly impossible in a lot of places. But, you know, if you're in the middle of 19th century pre-Civil War Indiana, and you're among friends, literally and figuratively, you know, there's more possibilities. Fairmount, I know I've read things about folks living in Fairmount. I mean, back in the early days of Fairmount, you know, that changes pretty quickly, because there was also some pretty ugly racist stuff in Fairmount, even just before the Civil War. But you know.
Yeah, I can name names. There was an Alfred Walden listed as mulatto, and he served in the 130th with some of his cousins who passed as white a couple decades before.
Yeah, I mean, of course, recruiters. Nah, you know, you gotta offer up so many bodies. You know, it's like college recruiters. You know, we got so many desks and so many butts. You know, and that's. So I think that's, and especially if these guys could get by passing, you know, but on the other hand, you know, there's this is the other part. The downside was after the Civil War, when by 1870 things start, Jim Crow starts raising his ugly head in the area, and for example, the black soldiers' names were left off of the when you get to about 1880, they are publishing every year the honor rolls, you know, the honor rolls of Civil War veterans in Grant County. They're publishing them in the newspapers, and I want to say by 1880s the black names get left off. Okay. Before then, they were on there. They were on there. You know, you could find them relatively easy. Well, you can still find them easy, but it's still like public recognition. You know, and of course we know the military home was segregated. You know, they could get, if you're black, you could get a berth out there. You could get, you know, your due as a veteran, but it was separate. And by 1890, it was not good. I mean, it's compared to what it was.
I'm going to guess you might have known Ralph Kirkpatrick.
Oh, absolutely.
So
yes, great man.
Yeah, he and I corresponded ages ago, and of course there's.
Oh yeah, yep.
So listed in here is Alfred Walden, mulatto, supposedly died in the Civil War.
Yeah. They what was it? I did a thing on the guy, and I can't remember the name. The guy that was in the Confederate Army from Fairmount. There is a Confederate veteran buried there. And the guy, there's a whole thing. I mean, we've got some testimony from him. It has to do with, he was a Quaker. He was from Guilford, Guilford County, North Carolina. Okay. And he was living in Fairmount. They'd moved up, the whole thing. But he still owned property in Guilford. So the war was coming on real fast. And he thought, I better get down there and unload that property, because it's probably not going to be worth anything. Well, he got down there and he got drafted, or not impressed, into the Confederate Army. And there he was. And he said, thank God we got captured. But he couldn't convince the Union guys he was from Indiana. And so he got taken to a prison in Indianapolis, Fort Harrison, which was not a great place. But finally, his relatives came down from Fairmount and vouched for him. And he said he had to sign a statement that he would not rejoin the Confederate Army. And he said, I have absolutely no intention of doing that. I didn't in the first place. So he's buried in the cemetery. Yeah, Ralph Kirkpatrick, man, I really enjoyed talking with him.
Yeah, I never met him in person, but we corresponded a whole bunch in the 80s.
In terms of bricks and mortar of history. Would anyone know if any of these buildings were still standing anywhere in Grant County that these men and women would have entered into and sat
Yes.
and talked? And
Yes. There's Bill.
yes.
In Fairmount, some of the buildings along Back Creek, and I'm a little hazy about the names, but the Back Creek Church itself was there, the meeting house. Now it's been built around. It's still there. You know what I'm saying? It's been encompassed into a. And the houses, the Hills. I think the house that belonged to the Hills, the Nixon, the Rushes.
Okay.
They're still there.
Okay.
Like I say, in various forms. Over in let's see, the Israel Jenkins farm is still very nicely. That's nicely restored. That's one of the best ones that are out there.
Mm.
The Sugar House that's on State Road 37. It's not.
Oh, yes.
You know, it's changed hands, but the people who own it now are taking care, and that was a place. There is a barn, a Ratliff barn, that's a bit west of. It's the John Ratliff property. Okay, the Ratliffs. No, they don't own it anymore, but they owned it until the 1970s, I believe. Let's see, I'm trying to think. In Marion, see, a lot of times what happened was that during the Civil War and after the Civil War, a lot of the Quakers did well. Of course, they didn't go to the service. I mean, you know, they were objectors. So, but they were able to work the farms and catch the upmarket in agricultural commodities. A lot of them made money, whereas the other guys didn't do so well. And what happened was that a lot of those original structures were turned into hog houses and corn cribs, and they didn't want to live in a log cabin. They wanted a frame house. Now, some of the more prosperous ones had brick houses before the Civil War, and a lot of them came down around the time of the First World War, because they were clearing every inch of available land, you know, draining and planting fence row to fence row, and so there are some more, but they don't come to mind exactly. Oh, I'll tell you, the Nathan Fraser House. Nathan Fraser House is on River Road, across from Motter Park. It's a beautiful. It's incredible, and it was. I think that one is like one of the earlier ones, like from maybe even before 1850, because Fraser was well-to-do, and he was a pal of the Wallace family. David Wallace, you know, Lew Wallace's uncle, you know, the group from Connorsville. Is it Connorsville? Well, anyways, Nathan Way Fraser House is a beauty. So there are some. Well,
thank you, Bill. I greatly appreciate that. I didn't know.
I think the people that did that study, that's part of the exhibit, I think they've. Oh. Did they identify some of the places that are still there?
I think so. Yeah, there's quite a bit of information there.
And then it's kind of hard also, because they took, you know, when they got their land grants, or when they purchased land from the federal government, they'd have a piece here and a piece, you know, 3 miles away, and a piece up there. And it's hard sometimes to tell. I wonder if Rhonda, do you know if that house, that Harris house in Gas City, or you know what I'm talking about, the big brick one on Main Street?
Gas City.
It's been restored.
Oh yes.
Oh yeah. I don't know if
is that pre-Civil War?
Was it just east?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's maybe more gas boom or, after post-Civil War kind of stuff.
Okay, we're getting close to the end of our session here. Thank you,
Hey,
everybody.
this was fun.
Well, if you don't know, if you're over in the chat, down the bottom right corner, there's a little box that's got 3 little dots. If you click on that, it'll let you save the chat. So you can have all the information that's in the chat. So you can save that to your computer to get the information there. And
I'm sorry, Rhonda, how do you do that again?
in the chat box at the bottom
Yes.
right corner, there's 3 little dots.
Okay,
Click on that, and it will let
got
you
it.
save it.
Thank you so much.
And you'll feel free to contact the library if you have any questions or have anything else you want to ask. We'll get things to Bill if it's something we can't ask. Appreciate having you come. So next session, November the 12th. Love to have you all join us, talking about cemetery symbols. And Jeannie's a great speaker, so sure you.
By the way, just if I can interrupt, Jeannie Regan-Dinian was one of the founders of the Underground Railroad research in Indiana.
She headed that up, yes.
Yeah, wrote, what's it called? Path to Freedom, or I forget the name of the thing, but she's part of that too.
Yeah, she did historic cemeteries, Underground Railroads, theaters, historic theaters. She kind of had a handle of a little bit of everything. She's in like the archaeology type department. So love to have you join us for that. That, if you have anything, let us know. And we appreciate you coming to see us. And hopefully you'll join us again. Yeah, Tom.
I just want to really thank you for hosting this. And Bill, we've talked on the phone, but so great I have 7 pages of notes from what you shared today. Thank you. Rick,
I got a question. I have a question for you.
Okay.
Sugar Creek Church in Fairmount. It's outside of Fairmount. Now, when I was talking to our friends that did the exhibit, it was not a Wesleyan church. I think, now I don't know this for a fact, I think it was it stayed within the Methodist, what I want to say, the Methodist Conference. That they did not, I think, now I could be wrong on that, because they said they looked high and low in the Wesleyan records and could not find, all the rest of them were there and documented, but Sugar Creek wasn't. And I'm just wondering if they retained affiliation with the Methodists, with the main line. Anyways, thank you, everybody.
Tom, you asked me a question. I can't respond for some reason. Thomas and Lydia.
Baldwin?
Thomas and Lydia Baldwin.
Yes.
Great.
And Charles would have been, I believe, Thomas's uncle.
Okay.
And his father would have been, they're buried over. They used to be buried at Back Creek. Now they're buried at, I'm sorry, I cannot remember the name of the Fairmount.
Park.
In Park Cemetery. Thank you.
I'm running out of electricity, so I've got to go.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great
Bye.
evening.
Next time.
Bye.
Mhm.
Right.